Welcome to the Pursuit of Learning podcast. I'm your host, Clint Murphy. My goal is for each of us to grow personally, professionally, and financially, one conversation at a time. To do that, we will have conversations with subject matter experts across a variety of modalities. My job as your host will be to dig out those golden nuggets of wisdom that will facilitate our growth. Join me on this pursuit.
Today, people think that you need to step into the spotlight, climb the ladder, become the boss, or chase whatever version of success that's dangling in front of us. But what if there's another way? What if fame, money, and power aren't what we should be chasing? In his book, The Secret Society of Success, Tim Shurrer teaches us how to reevaluate the definition of success and learn a new, simpler way to go about achieving it. This was an absolutely fascinating and fun conversation with Tim. I learned a lot about how to step back and out of that spotlight and how to be happy where I am in life right now, which I think is a message more of us need. I hope that you enjoy this conversation with Tim and me.
All right, Tim, welcome to the Pursuit of Learning podcast, where I always love to start is, what is motivating you in life right now?
I am motivated to learn. I love learning, and I feel like when I'm learning, I'm alive and I'm full of energy. And so that for me is so relevant to this exact moment, because I just in August took over as the CEO of a company called Novak Leadership. And the mission is make the world a better place by developing better leaders at all stages of life. So I'm having to learn a lot of new things right now, but I'm really motivated in that learning. And so that's especially relevant for me right now.
And so did you just take that role last month? And so did you have to move for that, or was that already where you were living?
So I live in Nashville, and me taking this job, I'm still living in Nashville, even though I have teams of people in Louisville and the Northeast kind of spread out all over. So I'm able to stay home base in Nashville, even with this transition.
I love it. And moving to this new company, building teams and talking about how to grow your team, keep your team, and be a good team player is what we're going to be doing a lot of today. So why don't we dive right into that? And we're talking about your book, The Secret Society of Success. And where I'd love to start with you is with integrity. And you had a definition of the book I liked, which was internal consistency. But I also talked about moving because a number of years ago, you found yourself not living in integrity when you were searching for a house and you really got addicted to one specific area. And it wasn't the house that was the issue. It was why you wanted it. That's what you finally zeroed in on. So can you tell us more about that? And what does that have to do with the Secret Society of Success that we're going to be delving into?
Yeah, we'll start first at that definition of integrity, because when people hear the word integrity, most often they're thinking about someone having good morals, good values, right? Like being someone others can trust and rely on. But I found it pretty interesting that there is another definition for that word in the dictionary, and it's internal consistency. And why that's so important in the conversation today is there's so many of us, as we think about what we can do in our lives to be successful, we have to look at what it even means to be successful by our own terms in the first place. And for so many of us, if I were to ask you, okay, fill in the sentence for me, fill in the blank, success is, a lot of people wouldn't know with clarity what they would answer with. And so what happens is, because we don't have a clear definition of success in our lives, we end up living in accordance to all these other definitions that are just being bombarded, that we are being bombarded with in culture today. Success is fame, money, power. Success is stepping into the spotlight, climbing the ladder. But is it? Is that success? And so what I experienced is there was a time in my life where I was not living in integrity with a definition of success that really fit me. And this all kind of came to a head as I found myself one day wanting to have a house in my favorite neighborhood. And there's a house just a few minutes down the street from my current house. And every single house in that neighborhood's a mansion. I mean, these things are $2 to $3 million. They're amazing. And so I had this house searching app. I think I had downloaded 3 different ones. And I just thought, hey, this would be really fun to envision what my life could look like as the owner of one of these houses. And so I was looking at these houses, seeing which ones were for sale. It was really fun. And I started to put together what I was saying is my 10-year vision. What could a house look like that I could live in 10 years from now? And, what would that say about me and the success that I would have achieved? And what was pretty interesting is even though this was a far off goal, pretty quickly I found myself pretty dissatisfied with my current life because I actually wasn't making enough money to afford this massive house. I didn't have a nice enough car, all of the things that I would have needed to get to that place, I didn't have. And so what I started to think about and realize as I was kind of wrestling with this lack of integrity between the kind of person that I want to be and how I was really living and operating, I started really thinking about, wait, why did I even want that house in the first place? And it had little to do with the fact that my kids would be set up in a better school district, that, we'd stay near our current house. We love the kind of area that we live in. It had less to do with that, and it had more to do with how other people would perceive me as the owner of one of these houses. And I actually realized that I actually just wanted people to look at me as successful. Whether or not we were working in the same industry, whether or not people really knew all that I did, if I was the owner of one of these mansions, surely people would look at me and say, that guy is successful. And that to me is not a great motivation in doing anything. And so I had a really great moment of self-awareness and realized the problem was not the house at all. It was really my intention for wanting one of those houses. And so I learned a really great lesson there around, how we can actually show up and how we can leverage a better definition of success to have us making better decisions and wanting different and better things.
And so when you were in that mode of, you were almost in a comparison trap, not even with other people, but with your future self that you were envisioning, that's what you define as the spotlight mindset, wanting to be in the spotlight and being seen as successful. And the spotlight mindset is really what we're going to spend most of this conversation trying to get out of, because you view it as not the right mindset for us to succeed in life. You list about 7 symptoms that we can see when someone's trapped in that mindset. Do you want to tell the listeners, what is the spotlight mindset? And we don't need to go into all 7, but what are some of the symptoms that really jump out at you that when you see them happening, you just smile and think that poor person's in the spotlight?
Yeah. So let me start by saying the spotlight mindset is not the place that we want to be. And in fact, it's going to be the thing that is going to keep us from where we ultimately want to go. I think then that begs the question, where do we ultimately want to go? And what I've learned as I've written this book and have been pursuing what I can do in my life to have the kind of meaning and impact that I'm looking for, I've really been inspired by this guy named Michael Collins. And a lot of people are not familiar with Michael Collins at all, but you probably know about Apollo 11. You've got Neil Armstrong, Buzz Aldrin, one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind. But Michael Collins is the guy that Ubers Neil and Buzz to the moon. He drops them off so those guys can do all the various tasks that they have to do on the moon's surface, while Michael actually stays back in the command module and orbits the moon something like 26 times until those guys are ready to be picked up and brought back to Earth. And what I love so much about this story is when Michael actually gets back to Earth and sits down with the press, he talks about how content he was to have had one of those 3 seats. He was happy to be part of the mission. So why is it that for us to, be, quote, successful, we feel like we have to step into the spotlight, climb the ladder, be the boss? Do we have to walk on the moon to be happy? And what I've learned from Michael Collins and from other people that I call the secret society of success is these are people who have shown me a new way to live and a new way to define success that isn't fame, money, and power. And I think there's a lot of people that when they think about the kind of life that they want to live, this idea of being content in the role that we sit in, or, for us to help others or be a part of a greater mission, that for us would be success. But we're fighting against this thing that is trying to convince us that the only way to be successful is fame, money, and power. And I just don't buy it. And I don't think the rest of us do either. And so for us to make an entrance into the secret society of success, we have to think about success differently. And so I tell you all of that because if there is a thing that is going to keep us from the secret society, it is the spotlight mindset. And the spotlight mindset is what I just defined simply as an unhealthy desire for attention and recognition. And the key word here is that word, unhealthy. Because to want a little attention or recognition, that's just being human. We want to be seen and we want to know that we matter. But that actually, if we're not careful, can lead to an unhealthy desire for those things, which has us just demanding attention, demanding that people notice us and recognize us. And so if we want to avoid the spotlight mindset, I think it's really important that we identify where it may actually be showing up in our lives in the first place. And so there's a couple of these symptoms that I'll share with you. Striving is a symptom of the spotlight mindset. Do you struggle to find contentment in your life? Does it lead you on this restless pursuit for more? Or here's another one, you brought this up a little bit earlier, comparison. Do you wish you were someone else or wonder how your success stacks up against others? Are you jealous in a way that gets in your way? Or, here's one that I think may surprise some people, but it's damaged relationships. Does this pursuit after what you are deeming success, this chase for fame, money, and power for that next position, is it trumping other things in your life? And are your relationships suffering because of it? Is maybe your grind to climb the ladder actually hurting your home life? Are you winning at work and your kids don't know your name? So these are just a few of the things that really can pop up for us, symptoms of the spotlight mindset. And it's really important that we identify it in our lives so that we can choose a different path. And maybe when we're up against striving or comparison, or when we're noticing our relationships are suffering, that awareness allows us to make some different decisions and head more down the path of living in the way of the secret society.
So many nuggets that you talked about in there that we're going to hit on in the conversation this morning. One of the things that really jumped out, you talked about all the things we're chasing because of how we define success. And part of that is not just us consciously doing it, but also subconsciously doing it because of how society hardwires us as consumers to want more things, to want more likes on social media. And all of that training is putting us down a path of being or using the wrong scoreboard, which is something you dive deep into. Can you share with the listeners, what do we mean by the wrong scoreboard, and how do we develop our own internal scoreboard of what we really want in life?
Because of the world that we live in today, consumerism, a very consumeristic focused world, we are being bombarded with 5,000 commercial messages a day. Whether you're scrolling on Instagram, whether you're driving down the road, you can't go anywhere without seeing advertisements. And so because of all that information, our brains have had to kind of learn to survive in that environment. And so what we do is subconsciously, when we're up against one of these advertisements, when we see the messaging come across our screen for a new product or a service, we ask, what's in it for me? So what is it about this product or service that's going to make my life better? And then you kind of act accordingly. For most of these messages, we are ignoring them. Because if we were actually to pay attention, our brains would, redline. There's way too much information. And so what happens is we're constantly asking this what's in it for me question. And what that causes, if we actually apply that to our lives, to our careers, to our relationships, if you're constantly thinking about what's in it for me, that is not a great place to be. And I was at this event in 2017, and the event was around, finding your purpose. And this guy, Andy Stanley, talks about, all right, a lot of people are measuring themselves against these various scoreboards of how we're thriving or our current role or our position. If we want to find our purpose, though, we shouldn't be asking these, big questions like, what's in it for me? We should ask another question instead. We should ask this one. Who am I here for? And what I love about the who am I here for approach is it allows us to have big dreams and visions of where we want to go in our lives. We can bring our skills and our abilities, but it has us in this posture and in this mindset of thinking about someone else. And so if we were to listen to all these messages that we're up against, if you look at advertising, it's you can be the best. You can have the nicest car. You can live in the best neighborhood. Like we're being talked, like these messages are just out there so often. But if we actually look at what makes a successful life, it's really this idea of who am I here for? Helping others win. And if there's a common denominator for what it looks like to be in the secret society, it's that idea, helping others win. And so as we think about our lives and against all these various scoreboards that we see, whether it be on social media, and we try to look at our lives as, us being successful in comparison to others, I think the more important questions that we can be asking is how we're showing up for other people.
And you talked in your book about Adam Grant's book, Givers and Takers, and you noted that he contrasted those two different types of people. How does that tie into the scoreboard thinking? And to me, it also jumped out that there's a high element between the abundance and scarcity mindsets, which also seem to play into the secret society of success versus the spotlight mindset, which seems like a very scarcity-driven mindset. Can you dive into that?
There's this Zig Ziglar quote that's pretty popular, and he says, help enough people get what they want, and eventually you'll get what you want.
So powerful.
And I like parts of that. And I don't like parts of some of that. And here's what I mean. I like the first part. Really, it's help people get what they want, which is I am going to show up and add value to other people's lives. I'm going to help someone else win. I'm going to be a giver, to use Adam Grant's phrase, where that approach is way better than the opposite, which is if people show up as takers, where they're only going to show up if something is in it for them. That kind of goes back to that what's in it for me thinking. If that's what a taker does, they're constantly thinking about how whatever it is that they're experiencing is going to benefit them, and they will move forward if it serves them, but they will not move forward or invest any energy unless it has something to do with serving their agenda. So we don't want to be takers. We want to be givers. Like, how can we be someone who helps others win? And so that quote, help enough people get what they want, eventually you'll get what you want. Here's the caution I have for us in that, is if you start to show up in a transactional way, if you are only going to give so that you will receive, then I don't know if your intention for giving is right in the first place. goes back to what we were talking about earlier, the intention. Why are you doing the thing that you're doing? Are you giving to receive, or are you willing to just give, period? And so the heart of that quote is great, but I do think there is some caution for us. And I think if I were to rewrite that quote, that would be just speaking at the heart of what it looks like to be in the secret society of success. I would rewrite it as help people get what they want, period. And that's easier said than done. But I think that that should be the aspiration for all of us, that we are willing to help someone, willing to help others, willing to help someone on their journey and their climb up the ladder, regardless of what that does for us. Why? Because it just is the right thing to do. Showing up for somebody else. I think you always win if that's your approach.
It's both the right thing to do, and karmically, it just works. When you show up every day and give of yourself with no intention of, to your point, you're not giving to get. You're giving because it's what you do, it's your passion, it's the right thing to do. And when you do that every day, that's when the second half of Zig's quote comes into play. But it's either help enough people get what they want, period, or help enough people get what they want, comma, without any self-interest, comma, and eventually you'll get what you want.
Yeah. And maybe you will. But here's the thing. A lot of people would say, I've been giving a really long time and I don't feel like I'm winning in my life. What do I do now? Tim, I've been doing that. It's not been working for me. And I'm like, okay, by what definition of success, right? Like, do you need the thing to feel like you won, right? Like, Tim, I've been an assistant for people for my entire career, and everyone else seems like they've been given more responsibility, more money. I've not been given all that stuff. But are you to tell me then that I'm showing up in the wrong way? And I think this is it's great and honest pushback, but I think that you need to all of us have the opportunity when we're up against these situations to really think about why it is that we're doing what we're doing. Are we giving because we want the raise? Are we helping because we want X, Y, and Z? Or are we content showing up in that way truly because we believe that's our own version of success, our own definition that we're living out every day?
And that's a very hard, fun, challenging question as well, because I was having a great conversation with a young person yesterday, and they were saying they were content to show up and do the work and give their best and not push for that next step and not need to have it right away. And I did say to them, also recognize that if you, and this ties to what you yourself said. I said, I might have quoted you. I said, also recognize you may not get what you want when you're the quiet person in the corner just doing their hard work. Because A, people don't understand what you're doing. B, they don't necessarily recognize it. And then C, when that happens, you're not going to feel valued and you're eventually going to leave. So I think I actually did use your diagram in that conversation, Tim, because a lot of what you wrote in this book, and we'll get through that as we go through the conversation, it resonates with how I think about life as well. And so part of what I was trying to say to this young person was, it's okay to have that mindset, and there needs to be a certain level of self-advocacy. Otherwise, the person that you report to will often just think, well, Jane in the corner is happy. I'll just leave her there because she hasn't said anything. And so can you talk about that, what you refer to as the recognition gap? And then how do we as leaders fix that gap for our people so they don't sit there, do the work with really the mindset we want them to have, but then we don't recognize it and then they skedaddle?
For so many of us, doing our jobs with excellence makes us invisible. And here's what I mean by that. I was at a concert. One of my favorite venues to watch shows at is in Nashville. It's at the Ryman Auditorium. And I was at a show once, and the lead singer was playing guitar, standing center stage. And on the next song, they moved back onto a piano, which put them a little bit further back onto the stage. And just for a minute, the person running the main spotlight lost them. And everyone in the crowd knew what was going on because the light was doing like a figure eight on the stage. Everyone knew the lighting person was lost. And so the lead singer calls out the lighting person in a joking way. They just said, "Gotta stay with me, bro." And the show went on, but I thought, isn't it interesting that if that lighting person would have been doing their job with excellence, they become invisible. And it was only because of a mistake that they had everyone's attention. And I think there's so much in our lives for all of us in our work where probably feeling invisible. We may be doing really great work, but people aren't recognizing us for that work. And when I was working at StoryBrand, we had Dan Heath on our podcast, and he's the author of a book called The Power of Moments. And so he said there was a study where they asked a group of leaders, do you frequently recognize your direct reports for the work that they've done and honor them for that work? And 80% of these leaders said, yeah, I do that. And then they interviewed the direct reports and they said, okay, do your managers frequently recognize you for the work that you've done? And only 20% of them said that they were recognized. And so you've got that a pretty big gap there between the 20 and the 80%. And, Dan calls that the recognition gap. So what do we do about this? What do we do about the fact that so many of us are feeling unrecognized or underappreciated in our roles? What do we do about the fact that so much of the work that we do, if we're doing our jobs well, we become invisible? Well, one of the more practical things that you can do, and it's one of my favorite things in the book, is this idea called shout outs. Shout outs are something that I learned from my friend Sarah, who was running a company called Entree Leadership, which is under the Dave Ramsey umbrella. And so at the end of their staff meetings, they would take a couple of minutes for shout outs, which is them just calling out individuals for work that may have otherwise gone unnoticed, unrecognized, but they want people to feel seen and valued for their contribution, regardless of the role that they have on the team. Whether they have a lot of visibility in their role or not, they wanted everyone to feel like they mattered. And so they would take a few minutes at the end of a meeting. And when at one of the staff meetings that I was at, one of their developers got a shout out for pushing out some updates to one of their online applications. And what's amazing is a little moment of a shout out, 15, 20 seconds to somebody for doing great work, allows people to feel a little less invisible, a little less alone, a little more appreciated. And so this is the thing that we can do as members of the secret society, as people who want to recognize people and help them feel seen and valued. We can be the kinds of people who call out really great work when we see it. So we can't control how often we get recognition, but I just believe that if you are recognizing other people, I just feel like that's the kind of culture that's going to, lead to some pretty amazing things.
And for our listeners who may not have heard this one, I believe it was a Harvard study that showed that if you want your colleagues to feel like they're getting positive praise, the ratio between your positive feedback and your negative feedback has to be close to 5-1. It's either 3.8-1 or 5-1. And so when you think about that, every time you give that negative feedback of what they're not doing right, so if you do that twice in a day, you need to say 10 good things, else they feel like work is super negative. And so people don't appreciate how important those shout outs and that positive affirmation is for the people on their team.
And a lot of people hear us talking about something like recognition. And I think some are skeptical that it actually will drive results in their business. But what I've learned from David Novak is that, he says this is the soft stuff that drives the hard results. So David Novak is the former CEO of Yum Brands, which is the parent corporation for KFC, Taco Bell, and Pizza Hut. And in his tenure as CEO of Yum, David grew the business from $4 billion to $32 billion. That's billion with a B. So how in the world did he grow this business to $32 billion? Well, He created a culture of recognition where everyone felt valued and everyone felt like they mattered. And so David knew as a leader, he's casting a shadow. People will do what they see their leader do. And so David knew that he wanted recognition to be the number one behavior that he drove in the entire company. And so what he would do is he had a what he called a personal recognition award. He would find people in the business that were doing great work, recognize them for that work, and give them an award. And so he'd be out at a KFC and would go to a chef and say, hey, the original recipe, I mean, you're just driving excellence in our business. I want to recognize you for doing really great work. Can you take a picture with me? I want to actually send you a copy of this picture, but then I'm going to take a version of that picture and I'm going to put it on the wall in my office. Because when people walk into the CEO's office, I want them to see that you're the kind of person that's really making stuff happen around here. And so David started doing this so often, he filled up all of the walls with pictures of his employees. He started to put them on the ceiling. And so I have this podcast called Build a Winning Team. And episode 1 is a conversation I have with David about this. And we really center the conversation around how do you create a culture of recognition? And, David's done an exceptional job with this. And, but I love this quote by Oprah. And I think it's so important as you and I are talking about this idea of the recognition gap and, how we can show up a little bit differently. And here's the quote. We all want to be seen. We all want to know that we matter. And the most you can ever do for somebody is to show up and allow them to know that they have been seen and heard by you. So may we be the people who show up for others like this, because there's a part of being human that, we need a little bit of recognition to feel valued. And I think that members of the secret society are people who show up and let people feel a little less alone, a little less invisible, because we recognize great work when we see it.
Oh, it's beautiful. I love that concept. So where we're going to pivot, you talked about the soundstage. And so one of the things you talk about is not needing to be on a stage. And you have a Paul Graham quote that I thought was wonderful, was the way to do really big things seems to be to start with deceptively small things. And this really plays into so many people saying, well, I can't do that yet. I can't do that until I need to do this before I do that. Can you dive into this concept, Tim, and how this plays into the secret society?
Blake Mycoskie started Tom's Shoes, and a lot of us are familiar with Tom's Shoes. They've now given away over 95 million pairs. Really, the company was created around this idea of, one for one. You buy a pair of shoes and they actually will then give a pair to a child in need. And Blake now has had incredible success. The business, they became the fastest growing shoe company in the world. Giving away 95 million pairs of shoes is insane. They've totally disrupted the business landscape with this one for one model. Now you've got companies like Warby Parker and so many others that have adopted this. But what I love about Blake and how he has achieved so much success on the business front is he didn't get there by trying to get there. He never set out to create the fastest growing shoe company in the world. He never set out to disrupt the business landscape. He simply wanted to help kids get shoes that didn't have shoes. And so Blake actually, his original intent, how he started the company was not even to build a company. He just called it a fun philanthropic idea. He went on this trip to Argentina. He happened to visit a village where all of these kids didn't have shoes, which meant that they couldn't go to school because they didn't have the proper uniform. And so Blake thought, hey, how can I, go sell some shoes in the United States and bring back 250 pairs of shoes to just put shoes on this little village, shoes on the feet of these kids in this village. Now, here we are, 15 plus years later, and they've achieved all of this success, but they just started with this idea of one life at a time. And now that one life at a time approach has accumulated to what it is. But I think the lesson for all of us is You don't need a stage to make an impact. You don't need to have this massive platform. You don't have to have a big social media following. You don't have to have any of that to make an impact in someone's life. And I would have to imagine that there is one person that you know that you could help. How can you invest in the life of one person? Maybe that's even your kid. I told you a little bit about Andy Stanley. I heard him also say something where one of my favorite quotes, he says, "Your greatest contribution may not be something you do, but in someone you raise." So whether or not you're a parent, you might actually have someone in close proximity to you that you can invest in. Focus on one life at a time. Let that be enough. And maybe you will someday that will grow to the kind of impact of someone like a Blake Mycoskie. But I would actually say success is not really tied to that. Success is focusing on one life at a time.
And when you really push the focus on that one life at a time, you can always start right now. You don't need to wait for anything. It's a wonderful concept. And the other thing Blake did, and really early in the book, it was interesting. I wrote a question and then I realized later you actually talked about it, and I was like, oh, that's handy. He wasn't focused on this long-term future result. He was focused on, well, what am I trying to achieve and what's the process to get it? And one of the words you used was, you want to get lost in the work and realize, and when you were young, you didn't appreciate this line from someone you worked with, was the joy is in the journey. And so what does that look like? And how can our listeners, instead of worrying about the results and worrying about the success, just focus on what they're doing in the moment, in the process itself?
When I was working at Apple, Steve Jobs was the CEO. And I heard him say, the joy is in the journey. And I just wasn't in a place to hear it then, because I actually had aspirations of being a musician. I mean, I wanted to be the next John Mayer. And I was working at Apple almost as this, okay, I just gotten married. I needed some consistent money. But really my big dream was that after a few years at Apple, I'm able to kind of launch out on my own and go on tours and make records. That's what I wanted to do. And that season at Apple was such a huge blessing. I loved my time there because I learned so much. And I think that what Steve Jobs taught me in that quote was, he didn't say the joy is in having a lot of money. He didn't say the joy is in making products that millions and millions of people experience. He says the joy is in the journey. It's in the process. And there's a lot of people who are probably where I was when I was working at Apple. I'm working in this job, but I actually had this dream to do something else. And I wasn't enjoying the struggle. I wasn't enjoying that journey in the way that I felt like I could have if I just would have been walking with a little bit of a different perspective. And so, one of my favorite moments, fast forward, I left Apple and started working with a guy named Donald Miller. And Don has written multiple New York Times bestsellers. We grew a 8-figure business together. And one of my favorite moments from my time working at StoryBrand was about 10 days after Don released one of his books called Scary Close, we got a phone call from the publisher. And this phone call was the one that we found out if it were to hit one of these bestseller lists. And so Don gets off the phone, raises his hands in the air, and he says, we hit number 5 on the New York Times bestsellers list, which is the highest that any of his books had ever been on that list. So we high five and we hug and, we celebrate. But then after a few minutes of that, something really beautiful happens. We all went back to work. And I think some people would hear me say this and say, Tim, you are dysfunctional. You guys don't know how to celebrate wins. Like, this is a huge deal. But I look at it very differently. I look at it as, here's a group of people who were content doing the work. regardless if we ever got the accolade of a bestseller list, I was going to show up. My teammates, we were going to show up the exact same way the next day, regardless. And what we learned together, the culture that we had created, is we were content doing the work. We started to enjoy the journey. And, what I've learned about success from my time at Apple and, being in that moment when I first heard that quote from Steve Jobs to today is I've learned that success is in the process, not the result. It's more about the journey, who you're becoming, what you're learning, than it is about any final destination.
That flip switch for you, is that something that, it's one of those hard ones for some of my young listeners who are hearing. Is it one of the ones that we just achieve with age and we see it more and we feel it more and we realize, why am I always pushing for results? Why don't I just focus on what I'm doing, and the results, whatever they are, will come? So for you, when was the switch flipped?
I don't know if I've flipped the switch yet, but I'm still learning, is what I'll say. So the reality is we are constantly learning and living in this tension. And it's this tension between kind of the spotlight mindset. The spotlight mindset would say, focus on the results, right? Where the secret society would say, success is in the process. The reality is we live in the tension between those two things. And I don't think that there's any one day that we're going to wake up and say, nailed it. Like, I got this whole thing figured out now. I don't worry about the results anymore. All I worry about is the process. The reality is, I think we're up against decisions every day where we get to choose if we're going to focus on the results or if we're going to focus on the process. How are we going to live? And I released this book in May, and I'll tell you, I was challenged in that situation. Did I believe the thing that I talked about in the book that I'm trying to sell? Because it's so easy when you release a product or you put something out into the world, it's so easy to get caught up in, okay, how many did we sell? How are people engaging? And measure our success against these various metrics. But in the exact same launch, I'm having to think about, okay, what are the steps that I can take? What are the things that I can control to influence a more positive result and move me in the direction that I want to go? I can't control the number of books that I sell, but I can control how many, podcasts I might be able to, be on, and the kinds of conversations that I can expose myself to. I can focus on my marketing plan, and I can focus, all these different levers. What can I control? That's the stuff that I had to lean in on and really think about in the context of a book launch. So even now, I think I'm still trying to learn a little bit more every day and stay anchored to that idea of success being in the process. But it's a struggle, I think, for all of us. And for me to try to tell you, I figured this out, it's just not true. I don't think that any of us ever do in our lives. We got to learn to live in the tension, and I'm definitely trying to learn right alongside everyone else in this.
It's an even bigger struggle, Tim, when we get that stretch where the results aren't coming. And so, you've talked about social media and growing, and I have one platform that I predominantly work on, and it's gone extremely well for a year. And whenever I'm in a social audio media room and people are asking, well, how do you do X? How do you do Y? I talk about, well, don't worry about the results, focus on the process. Here's what you do, And if you're doing that daily, the results come. And then the last few weeks, the results have changed. And all of a sudden, I feel like a baseball player who doesn't have his socks on the right way. And should I change the socks because I'm in a slump? And I do recognize that even when the results aren't coming, focus on the process, reevaluate, and the results will come. You just might need subtle shifts to the process, but it's super value for people to really think of that one.
Yeah, and I think about this through the lens of a podcast, right? Like
100%.
Okay, so 1 month, your download numbers are not what you want them to be. What do you do then? It's like, what do you do when the results aren't measuring up to the numbers that you had set, or the thing that you had set out to do? The thing that you do is, okay, I can control the quality of the conversations. I can show up prepared for a guest. I can promote this on social media and create really compelling reels to share. I can, you think about all the things that you can do, but obsessing over your stats is not really going to help you do anything.
That's right.
Focusing on the results actually keeps you from wanting to do anything, where focusing on the process moves you to action. And I think that's maybe where you can have a moment of realization to think about, are you moved to action or inaction? Because if you're kind of almost sitting and wallowing in this, maybe you're focused a little bit too much on the results and on the numbers, where if you leverage those results to move you to action, that's more where you're focused on the process. So I'm sure you're challenged with that all the time. In good months and in bad, you just got to keep focused on releasing more and more episodes, keeping the main thing the main thing.
The absolute. In part of that, you may just look at that slump in 1 month or slump in results for a short period as, it's some people look at it as failure. Other people I like to call failure feedback, because as long as we're learning from the failure, we're growing. And so one of the things that I loved that you talked about was that concept. And also you phrased it as always challenging yourself and being willing to fail. I tell young people one of the greatest ways I learned to succeed in almost anything you do is from sport, and challenging yourself to, I refer to it as, do as much hard shit as you can. And you build what I call a get shit done muscle. And, so if you're training for an Ironman or an ultra marathon, all of a sudden that extra couple hours in the office, it's almost irrelevant because you've trained yourself that you can endure through those challenging hard times that you talk about. So I wanted to pass it over to you, and I felt we were really kindred spirits on this one as well.
I used to think that success was, a line up and to the right, right?
Up and to the right.
Up and to the right. No downturns, no backward steps, just up and to the right. But what I've learned from Scott Hamilton, who won an Olympic gold medal in figure skating, he's taught me that success looks like embracing challenges and learning from failure. And I had a conversation with Scott recently, and he said, Tim, what if we started to look at failure as 100% information? What if all it is, it's kind of almost identical to what you had just said. What if failure is just an opportunity to learn? Because Scott says any goal that you have, anything you're setting out to do, you're always going to have obstacles, difficulties, and setbacks. He says you will not be defined by those setbacks, by how you respond to them. So if we start to look at our failure as learning, then we actually have pretty great hope for the future, because we can respond in a positive way. We can look at challenges as opportunities to grow. Success actually has all sorts of 1 step back, 2 steps, or whatever, 2 steps back, 1 step forward, whatever. However your steps are going right now, it's not up and to the right, right? So what I love is this idea from a guy named Ben Crane, and he's a professional golfer. And Ben, at the end of every round of golf, he asks himself 30 questions. What did I do well? What did I learn? And how can I act on what I learned? And these are different questions maybe from what others would do in some kind of an after action review. So, that first question, hey, what did we do well? That's pretty common. But most people then would go to, what did we not do well, right? Like, what was broken? But what I love about Ben's second question is he says, what did I learn? It's not what did I not do well, it's what did I learn?
Subtle shift. I didn't pick up on that shift when I read it, but now that you're saying it, he's immediately saying, all right, there was a failure, but I'm not even going to call it that. I'm just going to call it a lesson.
That's it. What did I do well? What did I learn? And how can I act on what I learned? And, Ben talks about how if you focus on the negative, you're more likely to have negative things happen in the future. So you focus on the positive, you flip all of your, challenges or setbacks as learning opportunities, and it really propels you to move forward. So I am now of the belief that success, just like Scott's taught me, is embracing challenges and learning from failure, because to look at it any other way, I think is going to keep us from being at our best.
So for a lot of this for you, Tim, when it comes to the secret society of success and these mindsets, how has all of this evolved since you've become a parent? You wrote some beautiful words that your wife shared with you about, isn't it an honor? And so have you seen a major evolution in how you view success and how you view the approach to get to this success since you became a dad?
We have a 4-year-old and a 2-year-old, and those are some really challenging days sometimes. And you have to pull out all the tricks to try to stay in a good headspace. I love my kids, and it is very hard. And I think some of the challenges that I face at home and navigating kids that are exploring their emotions and trying to learn and figure all that out for the first time, that is so much more difficult sometimes than the hard conversation I have to have at work. So I think what I've learned is how important it is to stay in a good headspace and to have these tools, these mental tricks that you can apply to stay positive. Because I think that there's these days where a kid has a meltdown in a public place, and it's really easy to go to am I a bad parent? What is everyone thinking about me? All of these thoughts that we have in those moments. But I think it's also just as important to think about all of the things that I'm grateful for. In a moment when you're experiencing a meltdown, I'm actually just super grateful that I have the opportunity to be a dad. And also, look, I can't control how other people think about me. All I can focus on is trying to love my kid in those moments and help them navigate their own worlds and their emotions. And so a lot of this has changed for me. We could talk about a lot of different ways, but one thing that's really specific that comes to mind, I was holding our daughter. She was a baby at this time, and I was holding her for one of her naps. And I was reading Gretchen Rubin's book called it's called The Happiness Project. And there's a section in her book that she called The Secrets of Adulthood. And so she had this fun little list of here's these things that she has learned as she's become an adult. And so I was sitting there, holding my daughter, and pulled out my notes app on my phone and started making my own list of what I called secrets of adulthood. And I just started typing away. And at the end of it, I had written down 100 things that I thought were important, things that I had learned that maybe one day I would want to teach my kids. Things like grace over guilt, or things like, and the joy is in the journey, right? Like that's a lesson, something that I have learned as I've become an adult. And what was pretty clear to me after I got done with that list and started to review it was the things that I truly did value. And never once on this secrets of adulthood list did I ever write, make a lot of money, become a CEO. Like that wasn't it for me. What I wrote about was the importance of relationship, the importance of doing things that you love. And so I think the way that I define success today is very different from it was before I had kids, and even as I started navigating my career. And what I'm starting to do in my life is try to live more in accordance with a definition of success that is true for me, a definition of success personally versus one that is being handed to me from culture, or, it's not fame, money, and power. Success for me looks like being a great dad and doing work with people that I love. Success for me is helping other people win. Success for me is being a part of things that make a positive difference in other people's lives. The more that I can live in accordance with those definitions of success, the happier that I find that I am.
And which brings me to a last question for you is, when is enough enough? And the reason I like this one is I've been that guy you talk about in your book whose wife is in tears and needs to have the hard talk about feeling like she's a single mom. And so it definitely struck a chord in the heart when I read that. It was a bit of a piercer. So can you take our listeners through that concept of recognizing when enough is enough, reprioritizing our lives?
My friend Bob says it this way. He says, is it working for you? And is it working for the people around you? And that could be speaking to so many different things. But if your life, the way that you're showing up, isn't making you happy, isn't leaving you feeling fulfilled and content, if the way that you're showing up at work is causing harm in your relationships with your friends or your family, then maybe you got to start figuring out another path. It's hard for me to put a big blanket statement out there, but everyone listening, I think you know if it's working for you. You know if your definition of success, how you're showing up, you know if it's working. And I also think you know if it's not working. So I hope that right now in this moment, you just ask yourself that, is it working? And if it's not, maybe the solution is something as simple as finding a new definition of success in your life. I ask this question to every single person on my podcast at the end. I say, all right, finish this sentence. Success is. So how would you answer that? How would you fill in the blank? Because I think that can be the beginning of your journey to a different and better place. And, if there's been a North Star for me as I was writing this book, and, it's still a North Star for me and how I want to show up, it's this quote by Albert Schweitzer. He says, I don't know what your destiny will be. Perhaps some of you will occupy remarkable positions. Perhaps some of you will become famous by your pens or as artists. But I know one thing. The only ones among you who will be really happy are those who have sought and found how to serve. So may we be the people who show up in that way, who help others win, who learn from our failures, who asks questions like, who am I here for? And I think if we can be the people who redefine success and it not look like fame, money, and power, but it looks like helping others win and showing up at our best for the people that we care about the most, I think if we do that, we're going to be on a pretty solid path.
That is an amazing final answer, Tim. Is there anything in this wide-ranging conversation we've had today that we didn't cover that you want to get across to the listener?
I don't know if I could tell you anything else that I'd really want people to walk away with, but that, like, success is helping others win. And sometimes we just need to say that over and over and over until we actually believe it. But I think being a giver, thinking about others, contributing to things greater than ourselves, helping others win, I really believe is at the heart of what it means to be in the secret society. And it's the heart of, I think, what will bring us the kind of meaning and fulfillment that we're looking for in our lives.
And Tim, where can our listeners find you?
If you go to secretsocietybook.com, my name's tricky to spell, so that's the easiest thing that I can tell you go to. It's got all the social links. You can even go there and there's a little link where you can download the first couple chapters of my book for free. So secretsocietybook.com.
Great. And we'll get some of your socials, etc., in our show notes as well. Thank you for joining me today. That was an absolute pleasure.
Oh, man. Thank you so much for having me. I loved it.
Thank you for joining us on The Pursuit of Learning. Make sure to hit the subscribe button and head over to our website, thepursuitoflearning.com, where you will find our show notes, transcripts, and more. If you like what you see, sign up for our mailing list. Until next time, your host in learning, Clint Murphy.